What is happening, folks? It is Kaz, and this is the Elevate Your Craft podcast, episode number 29. And this one is on technique and progression. I've always considered technique a very important aspect of my training, as I'm sure most do. Even when using weights, I really enjoyed learning new techniques and put a lot of time and effort into strictly improving and maintaining them. I was fortunate enough to have the importance of technique ingrained into my brain through previous martial arts training, so it translated really well into calisthenics. As I began to learn more about progressive calisthenics, I was delighted because there's an abundance of techniques that one can employ. What I began to discover through my training and further study, of course, is that technique in and of itself can be used to measure progress. On a general level, what I mean is that when we're first attempting a technique, we want to be able to achieve its ideal. However, that is unlikely, especially when we get to more and more difficult ones. And this can be because of a lack of strength, flexibility, or balance, for example. And what I want to demonstrate in this episode is that ideal technique is something that is worked up to, and it's okay to not be able to perform a technique perfectly at the beginning. And the important thing is that you consistently strive for its ideal. And one thing I want to stress before I continue is safety is always the primary concern. It's not wise to attempt a technique that is way out of your league due to the risk of injury. And this is where the concept of progressive calisthenics becomes even more important. Just like you wouldn't jump from deadlifting 100 pounds to 300 pounds without the proper training and strength development, the appropriate progressions are there within calisthenics. You just need to build the necessary foundation. With all this being said, the discussion points in this episode will be experimentation, technique as a principle of progression, and overarching considerations around technique. I touched on this in episode number 13 of the podcast, but experimentation is an important aspect of training. It's a way to test the waters and see not only where you stand when it comes to a certain technique, but it will also help you discover what you enjoy doing. And a question that I've been asked in the past is, how do you know when to progress? And experimentation plays a big part in this because one of the ways I determine this is how successfully I can perform a more difficult variation with proper technique. And more often than not, I'm able to perform the more difficult variation, but with loose technique. And at that point, if I feel that I can perform this loose technique safely, I acknowledge where I need to improve, then use regressions to help build a stronger foundation. And as I develop strength over time, I'll begin to incorporate the more difficult variation into my workouts to a greater degree. And a good example of this was, from my experience, is the pistol squat. And to this day, I very often use regressions to improve my technique, but when I was first performing it, I was always testing myself to see where my technique was at and pushing it just a bit further to see whether it would hold. And I still do that with different pistol squat variations, but at this level, I experiment with things like arm placement, for example. And it's also important to consider that it might not be strength that you're lacking. Mastering many techniques within calisthenics requires development in skills such as balance, proprioception, and coordination. Or it could be a matter of flexibility. So it's important to include them in the overall equation. And that's why it's so important to experiment. It gives you a snapshot of your current capabilities. It was because I began to appreciate the value of experimentation that I employed the training method of having 3 techniques within a certain muscle group or muscle groups that I would prioritize. And I've discussed this method before, but the first is a variation that I can perform very comfortably, maintaining proper technique throughout. The second is a more challenging variation that I can perform with proper technique, but less comfortably. And the third is a variation that is the most challenging. And more specifically, the third variation is generally one in which my technique can be much improved, and I'm working toward achieving its ideal. The first two variations are there, in essence, to build a greater foundation for the third. So have fun with them. Carefully analyze where your weaknesses are when you try a new technique and begin to improve them using regressions. And not only that, by actually performing the new, more difficult variation, that will also help develop the necessary confidence, skill, and strength you need to tighten up that technique. Now, what constitutes tightening up, you ask? This is where the concept of progressive calisthenics comes to the rescue. And my goal here is not to get too philosophical, but cleaning up your technique is being able to perform the movement closer and closer to its most difficult method. Similar to all other principles of progression, an exercise can be made more or less difficult based on how this technique is executed. And this becomes especially apparent as you get to intermediate and advanced exercises. As you run through the chain of progressions, improvements in technique become smaller, but the degree of difficulty larger. And this is why the smallest tweaks to a technique can make it sufficiently difficult. For example, in the front lever, it is common for the practitioner's back to arch due to insufficient core strength. And while it may seem like a slight detail, straightening the back requires a tremendous amount of core strength, making the hold much more difficult. Similarly, on a more beginner level, it is common for those new to the push-up to either sag at the hips or push the hips too high, both due to an inability to stabilize the core. And the goal here for both, then, is to begin tightening technique by straightening the back and further engaging the core. And I reiterate, this may seem like a simple thing to do, but it can take weeks or even months to make meaningful progress in improving technique. What I want to illustrate here is one can use technique as a gauge of competency. If you're approaching its ideal through hard work, you're on the right track. It may require a bit of patience, but the more you can master the technique of less difficult variations, the more it will pay off when you get to intermediate and advanced techniques. I know for myself, my urge to move on to more difficult progressions has come back to bite me, and I learned it the hard way. The pistol squat is, again, a great example. I was so anxious to perform it that I neglected to incorporate things like assisted or self-assisted variations, which would have really helped to tighten up my technique. In other words, I didn't build a strong enough foundation. I found that my technique was too loose for my own standards, and because of this, I've had to take a step back and rebuild. And this was an important lesson. One of the main concepts within progressive calisthenics is understanding how to make a variation less or more difficult. And all I was focusing on was getting to the next level without putting in the time or using the other principles of progression available to me. Regarding technique as a principle of progression, I generally wouldn't recommend loosening technique in order to make an exercise easier when you're able to perform it properly. It should be challenging, but if regression is required, I recommend making other principles of progression like leverage or weight to limb ratio, as examples, more favorable to preserve technique. Breaking form can cause bad habits to develop, and we wouldn't want to sacrifice our hard work or risk injury. The lesson to take from this is it's okay to not be able to perform a new technique perfectly. Mastering it is a progression within itself. As long as you're aware of the ideal, you can use the improvements to gauge your progress. And you may ask, is it really that important to pay this much attention to technique? Well, other than the benefits of safety, efficiency of movement, and maximizing muscle contraction, it comes down to building the necessary foundation for your progression. Each step in the chain is there for a reason and will help you develop in a predictive, manageable way. For example, if I want to progress from the overhand pull-up to the close overhand pull-up, I can begin to bring my hands closer together in small increments, say inches. Now, it behooves us to pay close attention to how we're performing that movement as we move our hands closer to assess whether the technique is suffering. Am I introducing more momentum? Am I not maybe able to bring my chin over the bar? Or is one side pulling more than the other? If one or more of these things is occurring, it doesn't mean that we abandon it altogether. It just means that we are arming ourselves with the knowledge of where improvement is needed. Technique is a great indicator of where we are, and because there are so many different variations within calisthenics, it's crucial to develop it as much as possible with each progression to set the stage for the next. And just as it is important to look at technique at a micro level, it's important to consider it on a macro level as well. And what I mean by this is that there are overarching considerations when it comes to proper technique that apply to the vast majority of variations. And here's a listing of some that are valuable to keep in mind. Tense the body and contract the core. Maintain focus and be aware of your surroundings. Keep the back straight and scapula retracted. Understand limb placement and function. Control the neck. Generally, speeding a technique up will make the exercise easier due to momentum, while slowing it down will demand greater endurance, thereby increasing difficulty. And finally, always be willing to regress in exercise to build greater strength. In the end, it's about taking the leap and attempting a new, more difficult technique. It's important to know that you'll likely not perform it perfectly, but that is the essence of progressive calisthenics. It's understanding where you stand at the current time and using the principles of progression to add or mitigate difficulty. Technique is one of these principles and is a valuable tool to not only get the most out of your workouts, but to gauge your progression. If you like the podcast, be sure to follow on Twitter at EYCKAS. Facebook, YouTube, and iTunes handles are Elevateyourcraft, all one word. The website is www.elevateyourcraft.net. You can also find an article on the overarching principles of technique on the website if you want to take a look at it in text. I will also have a transcript of this podcast on the website as well. And keep in mind, you can get all transcripts of my solo podcasts on the website as well. That's it for me today, guys. Thanks very much, and I will catch you next time.